Georgia as a buffer colony, defense and diplomacy were. Introduction: a colony on the edge. When James Oglethorpe and his first band of settlers arrived on the banks of the Savannah River in 1733, the founding of Georgia was more than a philanthropic experiment. It was a deliberate act of imperial strategy, an assertion of British power on a volatile frontier. Georgia was a colony carved out of the wilderness not just to offer hope to the worthy poor of England, but to stand as a bulwark against the ambitions of Spain, headquartered just south in Florida. Georgia's birth, therefore, was both a humanitarian gamble and a military calculation. This dual purpose would shape its early years, from the design of its towns to the alliances forged with neighboring native nations. To understand Georgia, we must look closely at its role as a buffer colony, how it embodied the anxieties, ambitions, and entanglements of the 18th century British Empire. 2. Britain, Spain, and the southern frontier, Imperial rivalry in the Americas. By the early 1700s, North America was a patchwork of rival empires and native nations. The British, Spanish, and French all laid claim to vast swaths of territory, but their actual control was often tenuous, especially in the South. South Carolina, the southernmost British colony, was thriving economically but acutely vulnerable. Its rich rice plantations and port of Charleston attracted both profit and peril. South of the Savannah River, Spanish Florida was a persistent thorn in Britain's side. The Spanish outpost at St. Augustine was both a military fortress and a base for Catholic missionary activity among native peoples, anathema to the Protestant British. More importantly, Spanish authorities offered a haven to enslaved Africans fleeing from Carolina, promising them freedom if they converted to Catholicism. This policy not only undermined Carolina's plantation economy, but also stoked fears of slave rebellion. The buffer colony concept. British planners recognized that the best way to secure South Carolina's borders was to create a buffer colony, a populated fortified region that would absorb or repel Spanish incursions before they could threaten the heart of the British South. The idea was not new. The French had established Louisiana partly as a buffer against Spain, and the Spanish themselves built buffer settlements. But Georgia was Britain's most ambitious effort yet. In 1732, the trustees for the establishment of the colony of Georgia in America received a royal charter. Defense was written into its DNA. The charter specifically cited the need to protect Carolina from the incursions of the savages and other enemies, as well as from the annoyance of the Spaniards. Georgia, from its inception, was a military project as much as a social one. Third, forts, towns, and military planning. The layout of a defensive colony. One of the most striking features of Georgia's early settlements was their careful, almost utopian planning. Savannah, the first town, was laid out in 1733 according to a grid of squares, with wide streets and communal green spaces. But these designs were not just aesthetic, they had a defensive logic. The layout allowed for easy movement of militia and quick assembly of townspeople in case of attack. Other settlements, such as New Ebenezer, founded by Salzburgers, and Darien, established by Scottish Highlanders, were similarly sited with defense in mind. But the most important military installation was Fort Frederica, built on St. Simon's Island in 1736. Fort Frederica, the bastion of Georgia. Fort Frederica was Georgia's military heart. Perched on a bluff overlooking the Frederica River, the fort was constructed of tabby, a concrete-like mixture of oyster shell and lime, and surrounded by a moat and earthen ramparts. Inside, a regiment of British soldiers drilled, and barracks housed both troops and settlers. The town of Frederica grew up around the fort, and its population, unlike Savannah's mix of English, German, and Jewish settlers, was heavily military. Oglethorpe himself spent much of his time at Frederica, overseeing both the defense of the colony and its diplomatic relations with native neighbors. The fort's very existence sent a message to Spain. Georgia was not an empty zone to be exploited, but a defended British outpost, ready to resist attack. Other forts and outposts, Frederica was the linchpin, but it was not the only fortification. Fort St. Andrews on Cumberland Island, Fort St. George, near the Satilla River, and various smaller outposts dotted the coast and the inland trails. These forts formed a chain of defense, designed to slow or repel any Spanish advance from Florida. 4. The Spanish threat. Contest for the borderlands. The reality of danger. How real was the Spanish threat? For most of the 1730s and 1740s, the answer was very real indeed. Spanish Florida was underpopulated and militarily weak compared to British Carolina, but it was a base for raids and a rallying point for anti-British sentiment among native groups and enslaved Africans. Spanish agents actively courted native nations, seeking alliances to disrupt British settlements. Rumors of Spanish plots and papist intrigues circulated constantly in Savannah and Charleston. Meanwhile, the British Crown pressed the trustees and Oglethorpe to keep up the pressure and vigilance. War of Jenkins' Ear and the Battle of Bloody Marsh tensions came to a head in the War of Jenkins' Ear, 1739-1748, a conflict sparked by commercial rivalry and personal affronts, but quickly spreading to the Imperial frontier. In 1742, Spanish forces launched a major invasion of Georgia, landing on St. Simon's Island with the aim of capturing Frederica and pushing north. The most famous engagement was the Battle of Bloody Marsh in July 1742. Oglethorpe, leading a smaller force of British soldiers, Scottish Highlanders, and Creek allies, managed to ambush and rout the Spanish troops in the dense coastal forest. The Spanish retreated, and the threat to Georgia was blunted, at least for a time. While the battle was small in scale, it was immense in significance. Georgia had proved its worth as a buffer, and Oglethorpe secured his reputation as a soldier as well as a social reformer. Primary source. Spotlight. Oglethorpe's dispatch. We found the enemy posted in the woods, their numbers greatly exceeding our own, but with the aid of our Creek friends and the bravery of our Highlanders, we emerged victorious. The enemy retreated in confusion, and we remained vigilant for their return. James Oglethorpe, Letter to the Trustees, July 1742. V. Diplomacy with native nations, the key to survival. The central role of native alliances. Georgia's defensive success did not rest on forts alone. Just as vital, if not more so, was the colony's ability to forge alliances with the native nations who controlled the interior. The British could not hope to defend their settlements, let alone expand, without native cooperation. Here, diplomacy was as important as muskets. The Creek Confederacy and the Yamacraw. The most significant native power in the region was the Creek Confederacy, a loose alliance of towns and tribes stretching from Georgia deep into Alabama. The Creeks were skilled diplomats, adept at playing the British, Spanish, and French against one another. Their cooperation was never guaranteed. It had to be continually earned. At the local level, the Yamacraw, a small band led by the charismatic chief Tomochichi, were especially important. When Oglethorpe arrived in 1733, it was Tomochichi who welcomed him, helped him select the site for Savannah, and forged the first alliance between the British and the Creeks. Tomochichi and Mary Musgrove, diplomats of the borderland. Tomochichi quickly became one of the most remarkable figures in Georgia's early history. Despite his limited numbers, his leadership and influence were considerable. He saw in the British an opportunity to gain allies against rival native groups and to access European goods and trade. Mary Musgrove, the daughter of a Creek mother and an English father, served as the indispensable bridge between the two cultures. Fluent in both English and Muskogee, she was Oglethorpe's interpreter and advisor, negotiating treaties, smoothing misunderstandings, and facilitating trade. Their three-way partnership, Oglethorpe, Tomochichi, and Mary Musgrove, formed the backbone of Georgia's early diplomacy. Primary source spotlight, Tomochichi's speech to the trustees. Here is a little present. I give it to you in token of my friendship. I trust you will be good to us and to our children. Let there be peace always between us. Tomochichi, speaking to Oglethorpe and the trustees, 1734, treaty-making and land cessions. Within months of Georgia's founding, Oglethorpe secured a series of land cessions from Tomochichi and other Creek leaders, giving the British rights to settle along the Savannah River. In return, the British offered gifts, trade goods, and promises of protection. The negotiations were often ceremonial, involving speeches, wampum belts, and elaborate rituals. Yet, these treaties were never unconditional. The Creeks expected reciprocity and continued respect for their sovereignty. The British, for their part, needed native friendship far more than they sometimes admitted. Cross-cultural diplomacy and tensions. Despite the initial goodwill, relations were never entirely smooth. Some settlers resented the limits placed on their expansion by Creek claims. Others, unused to the protocols of native diplomacy, committed blunders or gave offense. Still, as long as Oglethorpe and Tomochichi lived, the peace largely held. The British presence in Georgia was, in many ways, a negotiated one, dependent on the goodwill and strategic interests of the region's native peoples. 6. The buffer zone, in action, defense, trade, and everyday life. Militia, muster, and watchfulness. Every able-bodied settler was expected to serve in the militia. Drills were regular and weapons were kept ready. The sight of soldiers marching through Savannah-esque squares or manning the ramparts at Frederica was a daily reminder of the colony's precarious security, trade, and cultural exchange. But defense was not only about war. Trade with native nations was essential, not only for economic survival, but also for maintaining alliances. British traders, often licensed by the trustees, exchanged guns, metal tools, cloth, and rum for deerskins and other goods. Mary Musgrove herself operated a successful trading post near Savannah. These exchanges were both practical and symbolic, a way of binding the British and the Creeks together, even as both sides watched for signs of betrayal. Life on the edge. For settlers, life in Georgia was a constant balance between hope and fear. The promise of land and opportunity was shadowed by anxiety about attack, whether from Spanish soldiers, their native allies, or even disaffected neighbors. The landscape itself, swamps, dense forests, and meandering rivers, offered both protection and peril. 7. The changing balance, decline of the buffer, rise of the plantation, shifting threats and priorities. By the late 1740s, the threat from Spanish Florida had receded. The British victory at Bloody Marsh and the broader outcome of the War of Jenkins here reduced the likelihood of direct invasion. At the same time, Georgia's population was growing, and settlers were pushing for less restrictive policies, especially regarding land ownership and slavery. The end of the trustee era. In 1752, the trustees surrendered their charter, and Georgia became a royal colony. Royal governors, not idealistic trustees, now set policy. The military rationale for Georgia faded, and economic considerations, especially the expansion of plantation agriculture and the introduction of enslaved Africans, came to dominate. Georgia's buffer function was never wholly obsolete, but it was increasingly overshadowed by its role as a producer of rice, indigo, and eventually cotton. The fortifications at Frederica crumbled, and the focus shifted to wealth, not war. The legacy of diplomacy relations with native nations remained important but became more fraught as settlers encroached on Creek lands. The diplomacy of Oglethorpe, Tomochichi, and Mary Musgrove gave way to conflicts and dispossession, a pattern seen throughout the American South. 8. Conclusion. Lessons from the buffer zone. Georgia's founding as a buffer colony is more than a footnote in colonial history. It is a lens through which we can see the entangled ambitions of empire, the realities of frontier life, and the possibilities and limits of cross-cultural diplomacy. Defense and diplomacy were two sides of the same coin. The forts and militias protected the settlements, but without the alliances and careful negotiation with native nations, Georgia would never have survived its perilous beginnings. For modern readers, the story of Georgia as a buffer colony reminds us that borders are not just lines on a map, but dynamic spaces shaped by negotiation, compromise, and sometimes conflict. The lessons of Oglethorpe, Tomochichi, and Mary Musgrove, cooperation in the face of adversity, respect for difference, and the necessity of both vigilance and friendship still resonate today. Discussion questions. How did Georgia's role as a buffer colony influence its laws, society, and culture in the early years? In what ways did the success of the colony depend on Native American diplomacy as much as military strength? How did the changing nature of the Spanish threat alter Georgia's priorities and identity over time? What can we learn from the partnership between Oglethorpe, Tomochichi, and Mary Musgrove about cross-cultural leadership? Further reading and primary sources. James Oglethorpe, Letters from Georgia, 1730s, 1740s. The Charter of Georgia, 1732. The Journal of Peter Gordon, an eyewitness account of early Savannah. Michael D. Green, The Creeks, a critical bibliography. Paul Presley, On the Rim of the Caribbean, Colonial Georgia and the British Atlantic World Maps and Artwork. Map of the Southern Colonies, 1733, Library of Congress. Portrait of Tomochichi and Mary Musgrove, Georgia Historical Society. Plan of the Town of Savannah, 1734. In sum, Georgia's early story was written at the crossroads of danger and diplomacy, at the intersection of empire and native sovereignty. As the last of the 13 colonies, it was both a shield against invasion and a point of contact between worlds, a legacy that continues to shape the region to this day.